All right, welcome back to the Leadership Puzzle, where we explore what it really takes to lead in today's chaotic world. Today's guest is someone who quite literally has climbed mountains. I'm really excited because he helps others do the same, not only in life, but in leadership. So, John Graham is executive director of Giraffe Heroes Project, a former diplomat who has gone into some of the world's most volatile environments like Libya and Vietnam. He's advised senators, he's authored multiple books, he's climbed Mount Everest, and now uses his storytelling, activism, and wildly successful TikTok account, Badass Granddad, to challenge us all to stick our necks out for what matters. So today we're going to cover a lot of topics. Probably the most important is how we discuss uh, conquering our own mountains within us and how the most powerful leadership moves are the ones that we take ourselves. So, John, I'm so excited to welcome you to the Leadership Puzzle.
I'm happy to be here. The only correction I would give to what you just said. It's a marvelous introduction. Thank you so much. I never did climb Mount Everest.
Oh,
Uh, I I got as far as the Tibetan side of the mountain, but never got to the top. But anyway, there we are. The rest of it, I swear, is true.
okay. Well, I threw that in, because I remember we had that our conversation about Krakauer, and so in my mind, it's like, oh well, he's Everest guy, but so there you go. But definitely a mountain climber, cold, high altitude kind of mountain. So that's fantastic. Well, I don't think I could ever do justice to all of your accomplishments. So I'd love for you to just hit a couple of the top three, maybe four accomplishments in your lifetime that you go, yeah, those are I'm really, really most proud of, just to help the audience set the stage of what an amazing person and leader we have on the show today.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. That's a tall order. And there are so many points. There's an arc to my life that's has taken me in lots of places. I would guess that to start at the beginning, I grew up in a very placid community, Tacoma, Washington, in a very placid family. I love my parents, but I was a skinny kid, got bullied a lot, looking for a role model. My father wasn't that role model. Nice guy, but he got pushed around by everybody else. And so, there I was, bullied kid, and something strange happened. And I won't go into all the details, but something strange happened. And I ended up one summer, I was just 17 years old, working on a freighter, going to the Far East and back. Now, in those days, we're talking late 50s. No containers. This was a big boat with run by 50 or 60 really tough guys. And there I was in the middle of them. I remember the very first night out to sea, out from San Francisco, where we had left. A seaman comes up to me and begins making, sexual advances. And another seaman, this huge black guy named Roy, grabs this guy, throws him up against the bulkhead, beats the shit out of him, throws him back down to the deck with the most magnificent stream of cussing I'd ever heard in my life. Now, I never had a life like that. My father could never have done such a thing. Things like that didn't happen in Tacoma, Washington. And that rest of that trip was like that. These 50 or 60 guys sort of took me under their wing, and they were determined to teach me life lessons that they knew I would never get in school or in Tacoma, Washington.
Wow.
And
Well,
let's
so you had an angel sitting there just watching over you from the get-go. That's amazing.
Well, it happened throughout my whole life was like that. I kept walking away from all these difficult things, and then but this in this trip, I mean, there were things you might call difficult. I mean, 17 years old, I was in a bar fight and all kinds of stuff, and but the thing was, Jeff, that trip opened my eyes to a wider world. Now, you asked for key points. This trip was a key point because I had come from this total white bread community, and all of a sudden I saw this huge world out there. And I also saw what real men were, I thought, anyway. They weren't like my father. They were like John Wayne, for example. And I was determined that I had to become a man like that and engage this wonderful, colorful world with bar fights and bar girls and all the stuff these seamen showed me. So I came back from that, and a year later, I was hitchhiking through the Revolutionary War in Algeria, and this is when the French were getting their butts kicked by the rebels in Algeria for fighting for independence. And I walked into the country. I was smart enough to put an American flag over my chest so that I wouldn't be shot as a Frenchman. But I stayed there. I stayed with some French Foreign Legionnaires, and these French Foreign Legionnaires were just like Roy, the seaman on the ship. They were big and tough with tattoos all over their bodies, and they were going to hold off the hordes of rebels with a couple of pistols and a machine gun. And man, they were real men. So
So,
my
but why did you go to Algeria? I mean, what prompted you to go there to begin with?
Well, okay. You asked for three or four things, but if I put the whole account is a dozen things, but I'll back up a little bit. It started out calmly enough. I got a university charter flight one summer after my freshman year in college. And my idea was to hitchhike around Europe. Lots of people did that. You know, you hitchhike around Europe, you go to France, Italy. It was too dull for me. So, first thing I did, almost the first thing I did, this is in the middle of the Cold War, just a few months after the wall had gone up in Germany. I went down to East Germany. I got into East Germany from a little steamer from Denmark, and they were so surprised to see an American tourist because this was the very height of the Cold War. I mean, it looked like we were going to start World War III any second. So there I was hitchhiking through East Germany, all these East Germans and looking at me. And they wouldn't even sell me a sandwich. They wouldn't even talk to me. But I remember walking on the other side of the Berlin Wall and with a couple soldiers behind me, and I could hear them click the safeties on their carbines. And if I even went close to touching my camera, they would scream at me in German. So it was very interesting. It was my first introduction to global politics. Here I
Yeah.
was, and I was so naive. I was so naive. I was, oh man, this is fun. And I hadn't realized that the wall only been there for 6 or 8 months, that I was in the middle of one of the flashpoints of the entire world, and I was walking down the Berlin Wall. So that was fun. So then I go down, I get out of East Berlin, and I realized that I needed to climb a mountain. So I went down to Switzerland and climbed the Matterhorn, which was that big spiky peak. It's on all the postcards.
Yeah.
And that was really a lot of fun. It wasn't that dangerous, but it was like the first big mountain I'd ever climbed. And I'm here at the youth hostel in Zermatt, and I see the newspaper headline of this Revolutionary War in Algeria, which brings me finally to answer your question. That's how I got to Algeria.
It's like, oh, there's a war. Let's go play in it.
Exactly right. There's a war. Let's go play in it. So I hitchhiked down through Spain into Morocco. And then I literally walked across into Algeria because there was a war going on. So there was no border control because no one controlled the country. And then the adventure in Algeria started with these French Foreign Legionnaires and all the rest of it. And that was a huge, really second big adventure was hitchhiking through the war in Algeria. And there were lots of adventures and close calls and stuff. But with that American flag on my chest, no one shot me. And so I went through Algeria, and everyone, I was staying with both sides, the rebels or the French, and nobody shot me. So I go back, and the next summer, now I'm really enthused. I've had the experience in the freighter and now the war and revolution. And I'm with the Mountaineering Club at Harvard, and we decided that we were going to climb the north face of Mount McKinley.
Hmm.
It was then called Mount McKinley. Now Denali, I don't care what Trump says, it's Denali. And we were we it was the highest unclimbed mountain face on the planet, and it was bigger top to bottom than anything on Mount Everest. So it was, if anything, it was a more difficult, much more difficult and dangerous climb than Mount Everest because it had never been climbed before because of the danger of avalanches, which would wipe off anyone trying to climb it.
Sure.
We're talking about a mountain wall that's 2 miles high, 2 miles high.
Wow.
It took us 38 days to crawl up it, and then the avalanches all missed. And man, there was plenty of close calls, rock falls, avalanches, falls in the crevasse. And the seven of us on that team survived all of it. And we were the first ones to ever climb that north face, called the Wickersham Wall. And it's never been climbed since. Some people have tried it. One has been killed. No one's tried it since in 60 years.
Really?
It's so damn dangerous. It was suicidal. And we were told it was suicidal. And in many ways, it was suicidal, except it never got us. We were 21 years old, and we thought that we were indestructible. Certainly, I thought, after my experiences in the freighter and in Algeria, that I was indestructible. So we survived all that. Almost, I mean, the closest call was I almost drowned in the McKinley River coming out,
Huh.
fighting my way out to back after succeeding in the climb. But I survived that near miss on drowning, and then after I graduated from college, the next big thing was hitchhiking around the world. Took most of a year. I had a contract as a stringer for the Boston Globe, so I wrote articles uh, on every war that I came across on this trip. The first one was on the war in Cyprus, which was really hot at the time. And then I covered the war in Laos and the beginnings of the war in Vietnam, 1964. So there were a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of adventures, including spending 3 days in a mud hut jail in Iran, arrested by the Iranians as a spy. But I got out of that one because the magistrate in charge had been educated at Purdue, spoke perfect English, and dismissed me as an American idiot rather than a spy. So I get out of that one. Anyway, so there I am. I'm in Australia working as a mining geologist. That was my degree. And I wasn't really interested in geology anymore. So I spent most of the time in Algeria with chasing girls and drinking beer. But I knew I had to find some way to pay for my adventuring. Now I was totally hooked, Jeff.
Oh,
Totally.
yeah, I can imagine.
Nothing mattered to me but the next thrill. But who was going to pay for it and have any independent money? So I decided that I would join the U.S. Foreign Service. I took all the exams and passed them. And when I was in Australia, I got an offer from the State Department to become a Foreign Service officer. And I decided, well, hell, yes, that could be a good way to have adventures. And I wasn't wrong. I very soon found myself in the middle of that revolution in Libya, the first revolution when Gaddafi came to power.
Right.
And it was another great adventure. I mean, everyone else in the embassy then was freaking out at cars burning in the streets and people throwing rocks at the embassy, but not me. I loved it. I just loved that stuff because I knew I was indestructible, and it was yet another amazing thing. So after
I
the
mean, I
rev
have to imagine that the U.S. Foreign Service just loved your background, your willingness to go anywhere.
Well, that's perfectly right, and you and in keeping with your comment, after the revolution in Libya, I turned to the State Department and said, I want to go to Vietnam. I'm volunteering to go to the war in Vietnam, but only if you send me to the most difficult and dangerous assignment you got. So they did. I became the advisor to the city of Hue, which was some of your viewers may remember that as the site of the Tet Offensive
Hmm.
massacres. That had happened 2 years before. And I became advisor to the city of Hue, which was a small city about 50 miles south of the demarcation line that then divided North and South Vietnam. And it was an incredible, dangerous place to be. I never knew one day whether it would be my last. I was there without a uniform. I was there doing all the kind of political work you didn't have to have a uniform. In fact, you better not have a uniform to do. It involved politics and intelligence and counterintelligence, so it was really difficult and dangerous. It was exactly what I wanted to do.
So
But here,
was there a particular kind of intelligence or counterintelligence that maybe you can share with the audience that you're like, oh, this was like really exciting. I mean, super dangerous, exciting.
oh well, yeah, there was it happened almost every day, but every once in a while, I would be the interlocutor between the Americans and the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong could have taken me out whenever they wanted to, assassinate me. I was very obvious walking around the city, but they didn't because they kind of knew that I had a lot of anti-war sentiments. I didn't give a, the point of fact is I didn't give a shit who won that war. I was there as an adventure junkie. I was feeding off the adrenaline rush. And I knew the war was wrong. I thought it was evil. I knew it was stupid. I knew we were going to lose, but I didn't really care because it was a huge adventure. Okay. Trouble
Well,
was,
that's just interesting because you know nowadays I think that adventure junkie goes in. Most of them go into that call it extreme sports, right? And yet you were like chasing kind of extreme scenarios that most people wouldn't want to be part of.
of course, most people wouldn't want to be part of it, but I did, and it was either climbing difficult, dangerous mountains or being in political situations where I could easily be killed. Sometimes, like I said, sometimes I was an interlocutor with the Viet Cong, and they saw me. I guess they saw me as an asset because they didn't kill me. But there were times, for example, when I would go outside the city at night and go to a pagoda outside the city at night, totally unprotected. And I sit there, and these black pajama-clad figures would file into the room, and we would talk over tea. And they were the Viet Cong leadership in that area of South Vietnam. I never got much more from them than propaganda, so I don't know if my those meetings were very useful. But nonetheless, I mean, these were it's super secret meetings about America's role in Vietnam. Anyway,
Fascinating, fascinating.
so but the key thing, this is the answer, and this is the start of the. This is where I finally had my comeuppance, Jeff. It was in a battle for Hue in what the historians now call the Easter Offensive, 1971 in the spring. 1971, no, 1972 in the spring. And the North Vietnamese decide to attack full force in Vietnam, but it was too early. They didn't take over the country for 3 more years, but they attacked across the demilitarized zone, which, as I said, is only 50 miles away. So very quickly, they threw back the South Vietnamese army, and many of the South Vietnamese soldiers had fled. And very soon they were within 10 miles of the city, with the only route out of the city was a single road south to Da Nang. The American troops under the peace agreement, the withdrawal agreements, had left. So the only Americans left in the city really were me and 3 other American civilians, totally unprotected. We knew we couldn't be rescued by helicopters because if a helicopter flew in to rescue us, the Vietnamese, our own counterparts, would be clamoring to get on board, and we'd be
Sure.
shooting our friends off the skids. So that wasn't going to work. So my life, everybody, those Americans' lives depended upon us winning the battle. But it looked like it was pretty bad. Like I say, the North Vietnamese were advancing close to the city walls. And I could see from my role as advisor to the mayor that the real problem in the city was the panic being created not by the North Vietnamese advance, but by deserters from the South Vietnamese army who were mostly, and I knew this, mostly farm boys, dragooned
Yeah.
off paddies the month before, given scant training, thrown up against a highly disciplined North Vietnamese army. They're being cut to ribbons. And they were falling back. They had deserted and fallen back on the city, and most of them were drunk or on drugs. So they were pillaging and raping, and they burned the marketplace, and they were creating a havoc. And I realized that if the city was going to survive, we had to recreate order, and we had to somehow create martial law, if only because then we could at least move more ammunition to those few South Vietnamese troops who were still fighting north of the city to defend it.
Right.
So I remember bringing my fist down on the guy's desk, demanded that he set up a firing squad and start shooting these farm boys. And somewhere in that sequence of me banging on his desk, it occurred to me that my home was 8,000 miles away. I didn't give a shit about the war. I was only there for the adrenaline rush. I didn't care about the people. I didn't care about the situation. I knew the war was wrong and unwinnable. And yet there I was ordering the deaths of young men scared out of their wits, drunk or on drugs. And I was about to kill them. And it was like a freight train. It just hit me how
Mm.
shallow my life had become.
Wow.
I was never a monster, but I saw then that I was a monster. I was becoming a monster. Nothing, I was consumed by my adrenaline rushes, and I didn't care about anything else. And I was digging this hole deeper and deeper. I was becoming evil myself. And I just wept. I mean, I think I did actually weep in the middle of this battle when I realized how shallow my life had become. And
So do you think that your passion and drive for those adrenaline rushes just blurred the line of ethical moral behavior with just whatever the next rush was going to be?
yes, I would say sometimes it covered the metaphor I like to use when people ask me about this pivotal moment is that it was like I'd taken a heavy sheet of plywood somewhere in my teens or early 20s and nailed it over my heart so that my heart, whatever my compassion, my sense of being with other people was negated by this adrenaline rush. And so I kept the John Wayne imagery of my life going. But now, when I was in my late 20s, people were living and dying because of my decisions. It's a lot different than when you're 17 and the only person you're going to hurt is yourself.
Yeah.
And so, it was like realizing that my life had become that shallow, and I had to do something about it. I had to somehow get that board off my heart. So obviously I survived that battle in Vietnam because when the weather cleared, fighter jets on the American carriers offshore bombed the shit out of the North Vietnamese attacking armies, and so the city and my life was spared. And so I come back to California. State Department sent me to Stanford as a reward for not getting killed, I guess. And excuse me. Um, and I have a heavy dose of what now is called PTSD. I mean, I walk on the shadowy sides of the streets in Palo Alto, California, to avoid sniper fire. I ducked when a traffic helicopter came over. I had terrible nightmares, et cetera, et cetera. But that was the least of it. I had that normal PTSD, but on top of that, I had this huge question about who I was as a human being, and the realization that I could not continue my life living it this way. I had to do something about it. And so I ended up in what in California in those years were called encounter groups, which is where you sort of got together with 8 or 10 other people and you spilled your guts as best you could and tried to find out some answers for your life.
Right.
Uh, and it turned out to be very helpful for me. I started off just telling my war stories because I realized that I had done far more in my life, more interesting and exciting than the whole room put together. But nobody seemed to clap. No one seemed to really appreciate who I was. They didn't want to see the John Wayne in me. They kept saying, no, 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 you're not John Wayne. You're John Graham. And there's a heart in there. And you got to find that heart because we think the heart is there. And they were right. I mean, the instant I tried to act differently, I found out all of a sudden I could be a better father to my two kids. I could actually make real friends. That if I pried some of that board off my heart, people actually like me. Um,
Hmm.
and that there was a sense of compassion, there was a sense of grace, there was all these good, quote, soft things were there. They'd just been buried under this sheet of plywood. And I remembered, I mean, I played with dolls a couple years past where when my Croatian mother thought I should, just because I was, I was a gentle little boy. And that gentle little boy just disappeared for a decade and a half. And all of a sudden, I remembered all that of these encounter groups in California. And so I began to crawl out of that hole. I mean, it was
Nice.
two steps forward and one step back. I'm not saying it was I'm not saying it was a clear path to success. It wasn't. I made a lot of mistakes, but I kept crawling forward. And by the way, in this question of leadership, I mean my leadership also changed a hell of a lot. As in an army system, of course, I could act like an army officer where you gave an order and people obeyed it.
Yep. Yep.
But back in the civilian world, I needed to do a more compassionate, a more sensitive kind of leadership and listening to other people and all those things that are now regarded as absolutely important to sound leadership, taking a broader view, for example.
Well, yeah,
So
I think you said that leadership isn't about power; it's about service and purpose.
well, that
Which
sort of gets ahead of me. I wasn't quite there
no, you
yet.
weren't there yet. Okay, so I'll let you keep going.
No, 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 because it was all part of this rebuilding of myself. And I kept looking for what was now I would say now, although I didn't really recognize it in the post-war years, is that I was really looking for a new meaning for my life. And this is
Yeah.
absolutely key. It was key to me then, and it's key to good leadership for anyone today. You need to spend whatever time, take whatever risk you have to take to find what's meaningful for your life and then stick with it. And what I found early on was that, to my great surprise, in that battle in Vietnam, the meaning of my life, which was so important, did not come from adrenaline. It just didn't. It was too shallow. And now I look around, and then as I began to crawl out of that hole and look around, I look at all people that I knew who thought they had found meaning in money or power. And it seemed like that was pretty shallow too, because I saw some of their lives, a lot of their lives break apart because the quest for money and power didn't seem to provide it either.
Well, I mean, yeah, because kind of post-war, you go into the 80s and it was all about greed is good, right? So that was where that really played out. So you because of your experiences, you understood the shallowness of what that money and power brings if you're only focused on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was still in that hole, but I'm looking around at the sides of the hole. I mean, where does meaning come from? It's not from adventure. If it's not money and not power, then where does it come from? And I rather quickly realized that what was giving meaning to my new life in the United States post-Vietnam was some kind of service. It was using the skills, and I had plenty of skills. I was big and tough and smart, and I'd survived a lot of stuff, and I knew how to do things. Applying all those skills and attributes to making the world a better place instead of a worse place, solving problems that needed solving, using whatever skills I had to do that. I felt a surge of happiness and well-being and meaning, purpose in doing that than anything else. So I began to focus, still in the Foreign Service, I began to focus everything I was doing toward trying to bring more peace and justice to the
Hmm.
world. Some of it at those years was in the anti-war movement in the middle of the Cold War, but most of it was oriented toward the third world, where I'd spent so much of my professional life to the poor peoples of Africa and Asia. At that point in our history, America only cared about third world nations to the extent they would be our allies and not be allies of the Soviets in the Cold War. That's all we cared.
Right. Right.
They didn't see the peace and justice issues, but I did because I'd been there. So I began to reorient myself to seeing what I could do to make that world a better place. And it turned out I was sent to the perfect place to do that, which was the United Nations. And by wonderful luck, they put me in charge of the division there that dealt with the third world, with these poor nations of Africa and Asia, which is precisely where I wanted to work. And so I began looking for ways to provide some support to the poorer nations, to give them a fair deal on trade and aid, to lessen violence, to stop shipping guns to every dictator that wanted them, et cetera, et cetera. There were dozens of issues where America was turning a blind eye because it really didn't give a damn except for that UN vote. But I gave a damn. So I became increasingly close to getting fired because I really started creating my own foreign policy at the United Nations. And because I had a hands-off boss, civil rights leader Andy Young was my boss. He was the ambassador.
Hmm.
He didn't really care. And quite frankly, Andy Young didn't care because he was convinced no white guy could ever be sensitive to the needs of black and brown people. He was wrong, of course.
Yeah.
Uh, but in any case, so he didn't care what I was doing. And I was doing a lot of stuff at the UN, mostly behind the scenes. A lot of stuff I never even told my masters what I was doing that helped bring more peace and justice issues to the fore at the United Nations. I'm proud to say, and I am still proud to say, decades later, that some of the work I did at the United Nations was about the struggle to end apartheid in South
Hmm.
Africa, which was, as your older viewers may know, a system of institutionalized racism,
Yep.
whites over blacks in South Africa. That was just awful. And I figured out that the way to deal with it was to stop shipping guns to the South Africa military and police. Uh, the trouble was that even though the Western nations, the United States and Western Europe, clucked that apartheid was a bad thing, there was so much money to be made in
Oh
shipping
yeah.
to South Africa that no one did anything to stop it. So the guns flowed to South Africa. The South African military and police used them to kill blacks, and that's the way things were. It was total hypocrisy. So I set about creating a plan, working with diplomats from Africa at the United Nations, and not, of course, not telling my own people what I was doing, and showing these African diplomats all the weak points in American policy regarding our hypocrisy toward the arms trade on South Africa. I even gave them some documents that showed them which American firms, for example, were most involved, which senators, for example, were the ones who lent support to the gun runners for political purposes. So all this began coming back as the Africans used the information I supplied them for them to attack my own government. I remember once that I saw an angry message that an African foreign minister had sent to my boss, the U.S. Secretary of State, complaining bitterly about American hypocrisy in allowing guns to flow at one hand, and then being hypocritically aghast at the evils of apartheid on the other. And he was, and in the middle of that message, that angry message, I saw a sentence that I myself had drafted 3 weeks before,
Oh no.
given it to my contact in New York, who sent it to his boss, and it had come rocketing back in this angry message. Anyway, after about a year of building up this pressure on my own government, I finally suggested that we had no choice but to go along with efforts to create a really strong embargo, a restriction on the sale of guns and ammunition to South Africa. because the hypocrisy was just too evident.
Sure.
So I convinced my own people. The U.S. finally agreed to crack down on the arms trade, and the Europeans had no choice but to follow suit. And in May of 1972, no, not 72. Let's see, this must have been 79, 70, 79, 80, 80. Um, I guess that's right. Yeah. Anyway, uh, the UN adopted a tough new embargo on the sale of guns to South Africa, and that restriction, cutting off the supply of guns to the South Africans, turned out to be an important factor in the ending of apartheid, and that's what I meant when I said I helped
Yeah.
that.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Now, you have faced both literal and metaphorical fires. I want to. You have a story of being on a cruise ship that actually caught fire, and so I want to make sure we get to that story because it's just amazing how you just face kind of fear and some of these things with the courage that most men wouldn't have, and so tell us a little bit about that, or I don't know how much when that happened in terms of your timeline, but want to make sure we hit that.
Yeah, sure. Um, I'm at the United Nations, and I realize that I can't stay in the Foreign Service anymore because they're moving much too slowly. My ideals are not their ideals. I'm going to get fired anyway. So I leave the Foreign Service after this episode with apartheid because by now I've made a lot of enemies from gun runners and corrupt senators, all kinds of people. So I leave the Foreign Service, and by now I'm a totally different person than before that battle in Vietnam. This is
Sure.
1980, and I need to find a new way of living because my head is full of ideals of peace and justice instead of adrenaline. So how can I act? How can I make some money and survive? And a friend comes up to me and he says, "Well, you've always had a good gift of gab. You know, you can lecture on cruise ships and they pay you lots of money for just giving some stupid speech on foreign policy." So I said, "Fine." And it turned out the very first application I made was accepted. And I was going to be a lecturer on a cruise ship heading from Vancouver to the Far East and back.
Hmm.
And I could take someone with me. So I took my 13-year-old daughter, Mallory, with me. So, and I was being paid, like they said, an absurd amount of money. It turned out that only half of it was was giving a couple of speeches. The other half, and they told me to bring a tuxedo. The only other half was waltzing widows around the dance floor. Part of my job. So anyway, that was okay. And so I decided to park my ideals off to one side and go make some money. And so Mallory and I are set sail on this cruise ship. And the name of it was the Princendam. And that cruise ship, 3 days out of Vancouver, 140 miles off the coast of Alaska, heading for the Asia, catches fire in the middle of the night. And there are some disarming um, comments over the loudspeaker system that finally wakes us up and says, "Well, we've got a fire, but it's minor, and we're going to put it out. But the ship's got some smoke in it, so we're going to ask you all to come up to the ship's lounge. We'll serve free drinks, and we'll blow the smoke out of the corridor so you're more comfortable." Very disarming message. And so I'm looking at my tuxedo draped over the chair. Think, oh, okay, all right. So Mallory and I go up to the lounge, but you couldn't go into the lounge because the lounge itself was full of smoke. So you had 550 people. It was a small cruise ship, way smaller than those huge things that you see on ads these days. 500 people up there, and they're all milling around outside. And because the warning messages were so wrong, very few, if any, people had warm clothes on. Half of them hadn't even brought their life vests,
Hmm.
but they were all out there in the cold. We're talking about October in the Gulf of Alaska. So it's already cold. And so people are wrapping themselves in curtains off the ship's windows and tablecloths and stuff, trying to stay warm. Key thing was, though, you look around and any fool can see that the smoke coming up from the sides of the ship, coming up the stairwells that we'd all just climbed up, is getting blacker and thicker. In other words, any fool could see that the fire had not been put out, but if anything was growing. So people start to get a little worried. They're out there milling around for hours. And about 3 or 4 in the morning, we're told to go to the stern of the ship. Everybody collects at the stern of the ship, and they're still passing out free booze. And they bring out the ship's orchestra. And I know. The comparison to the Titanic grows by the minute, and we're all aware of that. If the orchestra doesn't play Near My God to Thee, they play show tunes from Oklahoma. So, so, so we're sitting there listening to the orchestra playing, and the smoke getting blacker and thicker. And now it's coming up not just from the stairwells, but curling up around the sides of the ship. And you can feel the floorboards, the planks getting warm beneath your feet. So this is a situation that's bad. And then the captain comes out on the deck and he orders us all to lifeboat stations. He says they've lost the battle with the flames and we now have to abandon ship. So 550 people somehow get into lifeboats. And because this is a new cruise ship and the crew is poorly trained, it is a miracle that nobody gets killed of these swinging, swaying lifeboats. And they all get plopped into the ocean. About eight, I guess, 8 lifeboats or so. And Mallory and I are up on the port bow, lifeboat number 2. I asked Mallory how many people are waiting for lifeboat number 2, and she counts 90, and the side of the lifeboat says it's made for 48. There was utter chaos. Anyway, we all get into the lifeboat, and I remember I'm on the side of the lifeboat that's next to the ship itself, and we're banging against the side of the ship. So I and a couple other guys are pushing back, trying to keep the lifeboat from being shattered by banging into the ship.
Wow.
I remember how hot the side of the ship felt because of the fire on the other side of that steel. Anyway, we're all in the lifeboats, and without death, and the lifeboats all are gathered there, but they don't stay gathered long. They begin to be separated by the currents.
Yeah.
The key thing is that a typhoon is bearing down. Just to make things more interesting, a typhoon is bearing down. Typhoon Vernon, I think it was. A typhoon is bearing down. They distributed Dramamine seasick pills the night before, and they warned us that the typhoon was coming. But now we were not on a big ship. We were in little lifeboats, crowded little lifeboats, with a typhoon bearing down on us. It's the middle of the night. So we're all crammed on the lifeboats, and being crammed is not a bad idea at that point because it keeps us warm.
Yeah, I was about
And
to say.
the seas are still relatively calm because the typhoon is coming, but it hasn't quite hit. So at noon, at dawn, a big oil tanker, which had answered the SOS, comes into view. At the same time, helicopters are flying 140 miles from bases in Alaska, and a helicopter will hover over a lifeboat and lower a single chair on the end of a chain and put one person in it, haul them up into the helicopter. When they got 7 or 8 people on the helicopter, they would fly them over to this tanker and drop them on the deck and come back for more. But it's a slow process, 8 people at a time, 500 people. And now the typhoon's beginning to intensify.
Oh, wow.
So it's a race against time. The helicopters go as fast as they can. I see my daughter, Mallory, rescued about noon. So I know she's safe. A few more boat helicopter loads of people are also lifted off, and by about 4 in the afternoon, there's just 8 of us left in lifeboat number 2 out of that crowd that had been there earlier, and the helicopter is at about 4 o'clock. Signals that he can't come back because now the typhoon has hit in full force and it's suicide. You just can't fly a
Oh,
helicopter
yeah.
that close to the ocean, or for sure you're going to kill everybody on the helicopter. So The message is that your only chance for survival is a Coast Guard cutter, small ship. Two cutters have been racing to the SOS scene from Sitka, and they arrive about sometime that afternoon. And now they're frantically searching this turbulent sea, looking for lifeboats with people still in them that haven't been rescued by the helicopter. So everybody else is rescued, except for people in two lifeboats, and I'm in one of them, lifeboat number two. And the helicopters aren't going to fly anymore, but the Boutwell, and the Mellon, the two Coast Guard cutters, are, like I say, frantically searching for us. But the visibility now is closing in 200 meters, 100 meters. The wind velocity is picking up. Soon we're in the middle of a full-scale typhoon, winds of 60 knots. Waves up to 25 to 30 feet. It's hard to imagine that. But if a wave is 25 feet high, that means you're facing a 50-foot wall of water,
Yeah.
up, down, with this little cockle shell of a lifeboat. And you're almost capsizing every time the swells hit. So we're dying of the cold. We're all dying of hypothermia. Of course, we're all deadly seasick. We can barely move. But the key thing is hypothermia, dying of the cold.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and so I done enough mountaineering to know what hypothermia looks like. You get really cold, but then amazing things happen. You start feeling warm again, and then you go to sleep and you don't wake up.
You know, that's the end. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the way hypothermia works. So I can see we're in that stage where we're almost getting warm again, and I realize that the odds are really slim in this storm. There's still a half hour of daylight left, and that's a little bit of time for these Coast Guard cutters to find us. Because at night we're dead, because in this poorly equipped lifeboat, there are no lights and no flares and no signal mirrors, and of course, no radios. So there's no way to communicate with the Coast Guard cutters. It's sheer chance they can find us, needle in haystack. And this is with daylight. But in half an hour, 45 minutes, it's going to be dark. And under those conditions, there's no possibility whatsoever that we will be found. And since I realize we're going to die of hypothermia, probably in 5 or 6 hours, that means that we won't live to see the dawn. Our bodies will either be thrown out of the lifeboat, or the lifeboat will founder and we'll all drown or whatever, but we won't be alive at dawn. So we have not just 5 or 6 hours until we're dead from hypothermia. Really, we have 45 minutes until the last of the fading light. After that, forget it.
Yeah.
So anyway, and here's the key. I'm not a religious person now or then. But I realized that this time, out of my remarkable series of narrow scrapes, walking away from every one of them, this is the longest odds I've ever faced. And it looks like I really am not going to get out of this one. So I turned.
And you weren't even going after the situations of just, danger and chaos and whatnot. It was, you were on a cruise ship with your daughter.
Yeah, right. I wasn't even looking for this one. But I look up and I say, all right, I'm supposed to be praying now, I guess. I didn't pray for my life. I prayed for some answers. I said, I don't get it. Here, yeah, I know what I was doing with the first half of my life. I know about those farm boys in the war in Vietnam and all that stuff. However, I turned my life around. I helped end apartheid. Doesn't that count for something? And I got madder and madder because I said to God, higher power, whatever you want to call it, I said to God, I said, I thought the universe was a logical place. I mean, I went to a Jesuit high school, all that stuff about order in the universe, snowflakes and the way that everything fits together, logic, order in the universe, all that stuff. Well, there's no order in this. It's just stupid. Here I am. I'm a great engine of good. I can spend the rest of my life doing some great stuff, which I think is what we're supposed to be doing as human beings, right? Supposed to make the world a better place. And here, just as I'm getting started, I'm being wiped out. It makes no sense at all. So my prayer becomes this angry bleat, and I'm screaming at God. And I hear this answer. Of course, the other 7 people heard nothing, and it may have just been the wind. I don't know, but I heard it. I heard something, and the message was very clear. And I'm paraphrasing, but it basically was stop bullshitting yourself. Stop trying to bullshit me. Here you are. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Ending apartheid, very nice. But now you're lecturing on a cruise ship and waltzing blue-haired widows around dance floors. It's copacetic, man. And if you get out of this, you'll lecture on another cruise ship because your ideals simply aren't strong enough. You panicked over money, and a panic over money was enough to submerge your ideals. So you got to make a choice. You got to get serious about what
Mm.
your life is about. You got to get serious about the ideals that you found in California and that you that you used when you ended apartheid. You got to get serious about those in your life. That's got to be the pattern for your life. And if you don't get serious about them, then you might as well die out here because the rest of your life won't be worth living. I mean, that's a much longer answer, but that's the substance of what I'm.
Yep. Yep. Wow.
I'm looking up into this wild storm, and I'm beaten. I have no reserves left. I know I'm dying. And I just say, okay, yes, or something like that. Yes, I agree. The deal. And in that instant, the cutter Boutwell comes crashing through this wild storm. Would have cut us in two had the lookout not seen us, Jeff. It was so that on. And I know I tell the story every once in a while, and someone always says, "Oh, go on. Come on. You're just telling that because it's a good story." Well, I know it's a good story, but I swear it's the truth. It was almost at that instant of submission on my part that this
Yeah.
damn cutter comes crashing toward us.
I've heard that story a lot.
And we got rescued. I mean, 8 of us were rescued at the last minute.
That's
I,
fantastic.
I, I kept that promise. I went back to New York and I never looked back, and I kept that promise. Within a year or so, I had found the pattern for what I really needed to for the rest of my life, and it was working with the Giraffe Heroes Project. I didn't start the Giraffe Heroes Project. It was started by a remarkable woman named Ann Medlock, whom I quickly fell madly in love with, and we've been married now for 43 years. But Ann had started the Giraffe Heroes Project, and it was called Giraffe because Ann was looking for people anywhere on the planet who were sticking their necks out, hence the metaphor giraffe, sticking their necks out to make their world a better place, their communities, their nation, whatever. They were men, women, every color in the rainbow, from every walk of life, working on every issue you could think of, from violence in the streets to pollution to corruption, whistleblowing issues, whatever. And she would find them and get their stories told, tell their stories. And she would interview them and get some audio feed from the interviews, and then she would persuade a movie or a film star, which you could do in New York City, to do the voiceovers and create little 2, 3 minute um,
That's
stories.
amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, and she put them on radio, on black vinyl disc. I don't know how many of your listeners, a small fraction, even know what a vinyl disc is. It's a flat piece of plastic, goes round and round on a turntable, and the sound comes out. You're old enough to remember, but
Oh yeah, for
yeah.
sure.
Uh, and she'd ship these discs off to radio stations. In the beginning, it was small radio stations, but the idea caught on. That's because Anne intrinsically knew the power of story. I didn't. I
Yeah,
had no idea. But she intrinsically knew that telling stories was by far the best way to move people's behavior. If you want to create a hero, tell them the stories of other heroes. And that must have been the same when Neanderthals were dancing around the campfire or the troubadour
sure.
of the Middle Ages. Anyway, Anne was the troubadour of our age. And she had discovered or rediscovered this incredibly potent force for moving people to make their world a better place. And I quickly realized, well, not quickly, it took me a year or so, that my speechifying was far less effective. Or my writing learned articles in the newspaper or a magazine was far less effective than this simple tool that Ann Medlock had created of just telling stories.
Yeah.
So I saw that power, and it wasn't just because I fell in love and married, and I really began to understand and appreciate the power of storytelling. So the two of us have been doing it now for the last 43 years. And now we've honored, I guess, over 2,000 people as giraffe heroes. You can get their stories on the giraffe website, giraffe.org. You can dial up and get their stories.
Yeah.
And they're the same stories that people we found 43 years ago.
That's
Now,
amazing.
you may have mentioned at the outset that I've written 4 or 5 books, and they're all about giraffe themes. They're all about finding courage. They're all about finding meaning. My first book was on leadership, because that's an important theme. And I focused that first book on the outdoors because of my long career as a mountain climber.
Right.
The first book was called Outdoor Leadership, but the principles of it were ones that I've taught ever since in the books that I've written since.
Right.
So that sort of brings you up to date because Ann and I are still doing this. We're obviously no longer spring chickens, but
And you're not producing vinyl anymore.
not doing vinyl. We've switched to the most advanced forms of social media. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. In the opening segment, Jeff, you mentioned the badass granddad.
Well, that I was gonna involve that because boy, you were printing out vinyl, and now you are a TikTok influencer, badass granddad. So, I mean, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'm happy to say that although it got upstaged by the announcement of the new Pope this morning, that I've also launched the same series on YouTube. What's it called? YouTube Shorts. So you can find my badass granddad. They're just 3-minute pieces. And the first minute and a half or so is a story of one of my crazy ass adventures, or increasingly the crazy ass adventures of some of these giraffe heroes. And the second half of the 3 minutes is me drawing some non-smarmy life lesson from the adventure and adding that. Now, the lesson might be, about courage, about perseverance, about leadership, all pegged to the story they've just heard. And because they've heard that story, all the people are there with their nervous thumbs aren't moving on. They're listening to the rest of the story. And so it's been pretty successful. I've been doing it for 5 months now. My audience is now total over 150,000 on TikTok, and I've just started, like I say, this morning, or the first episode on YouTube.
Love
Uh,
it.
so it's on TikTok and YouTube, and dial up in the search box, Badass Granddad, badass all one word, and Granddad with 2 D's in the middle. Badass Granddad, and I've done 32 yeah, 31 episodes so far. So you can start with number one and dial and just listen or whatever. I'm having great fun doing it because I thought when I started this, aiming it at people a half or my age or younger, that I would get lots of smarmy responses like, "Who is this old fart?" I mean, Jesus Christ, what can he possibly know of relevance to my young life? Ha, okay. I got a lot of responses, all right. And in fact, I spend, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours a week now answering what I might call my fan mail because I get so many responses, and they're not snarky responses at all. In fact, very almost none of them are negative. Some of them are just, attaboy, glad to hear it. But many of them are honest questions and honest comments about people, young people, and their lives. And so that's why I take so much time because I think I owe it to these people. I've pulled something out of them to think about, and so I can't just leave them hanging. So I will respond to them as best I can. So that's taking a big part.
That's great.
I mean,
Oh, it's amazing.
the other part, Jeff, is doing what we're doing. I
Yeah.
do a podcast is also a great way to reach
Oh,
audience
yeah,
that I would never reach otherwise. And so as far as I'm concerned, these podcasts are a real win-win situation.
for
I
sure.
I can provide some pull for viewership on podcasts, and at the same time, I know my stories can prompt people to think a little bit more deeply about finding meaning in their own lives, because that's the bottom line of everything I'm doing is helping people make that huge journey to find meaning in their lives. Because I am utterly convinced that you can search and search and search, and you can go down one wrong path after the other, but sooner or later, you discover that the only really stable source of meaning is some kind of service. And how that relates to leadership? Well, to me, it's simple. That you're a good leader if leading means something to you. Now, that
Yeah.
you're not just there because you're put there in a position of power. You're there because you're there to serve. This is hardly a new thought, but damn it, it needs to be implemented by a whole lot more people, especially these days.
I think it
So
was Jim Collins that found that people want to follow leaders who can paint a picture of something bigger than themselves.
yes, they do, and the same, and that's why vision is important. If you're a good leader, there's two things that are really important. The first one we've talked about too much today, perhaps, and that's the search for meaning and finding meaning through service, seeing yourself as a servant leader with all that that entails. That's really important. And the other thing is that as a leader, you need to create a vision, and a vision is not an idle hope. It's painting a picture of a future that is real for you
Yeah.
and backtracking to the present day. I mean, I used to do a lot of workshops in person when I was still eager to throw my long frame into an airplane. I'm not that eager anymore. Um, I go out and do workshops, and half of them are on how to create a vision. And you create a vision by looking ahead 10 years and then spend, or 5 years, or whatever the time span is, and then meticulously putting together a picture of what life looks like. Who are you with? What's happening? What does that day's newspaper say? What's going on with the politics of your country? In other words, creating a clear, sharp picture of
Yeah.
something that doesn't yet exist. And then moving backward. Okay, if that's the way things are in 5 years, what are they like in 2 years? Uh-huh. Okay, let's do that. All right, if that's the way they are in 2 years, what do they look like in 6 months, etc. And moving back, and that helps people understand that a vision is not some bullshit written on a plaque in your company's foyer. A vision is a real picture of real results. And when people understand that, they get excited about a vision. Uh, and they're willing to see it as something that they might see as a yardstick and something they might use as guidance. And a good leader knows how to use that and
Yeah.
to keep reminding people that he's working with that what they're really doing is on a vision, and that vision is to implement their purpose, and their purpose is service. That's
Yep.
when really effective leadership.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time. I think there is another episode in here at some point to come back and talk about servant leadership and finding that purpose and in the context of that leadership. But John, I want to thank you for sharing your life with us. What an amazing adventure of courage and servant leadership. You've climbed mountains, you've navigated international conflicts, and you know what? You've showed up as your true self. And you definitely have modeled to our audience what it means to lead with grit, wisdom, and really finding that meaning in your life. Thank you so much for joining us.
And I'm still having fun.
That's fantastic. Well, as always, until next time, keep leading, keep learning, and keep putting on the pieces of your leadership puzzle.